Hi there. If you're learning about identity domain or getting into it, it's very likely that you will come across this terminology. You'll come across people talking about identity management, IDM, identity and access management, IAM, identity governance, IGA, privilege access management, PAM or PAM. So in this video, we are going to decode all these things to show you what's the difference between these terminology and how those are related. Let's get started. Let's look at the big picture first. So the three layers stack on top of each other plus one specialized overlay. You can consider that way. So we looked at four different terms: IDM, IAM, IGA, and PAM. So if you look at IDM, that's the foundation. That basically is where the identity data related to users, employees, partners are stored in directories or databases, and you manage life cycle of those data, and that's the identity management. We'll look into that in detail next. But IAM, if you look at identity access management, that enables access basically for authentication and authorization, single sign-on kind of purposes. That domain is what you normally call the IAM. Identity governance, if you look at, that oversees the access, not enables the access, it oversees the access. It answers the segregation of duty, it does auditing, all of that. So those are all those three aspects of identity management, identity access management, identity governance are very much related, and there are systems which only cover identity management. There are systems which are built on top of IAM that has some capability of IDM but not a full-fledged IDM, and there are systems which are only focused on IGA. With all of these, if you look at the privilege access management, think about a user getting specialized privileges, and in such cases there needs to be hardening, specialized layer for highest risk accounts such as admin accounts, root accounts, and service accounts. How do we monitor those and how do we govern those is the problem space of privilege access management. Let's look at identity management in detail. So basically it answers, or it poses the question, who exists in your system and what does their identity record look like. So that's the foundational layer, creating and maintaining, provisioning and deprovisioning digital identities across the entire life cycle of a user, and in modern terms even agents, AI agents. This is the plumbing, everything else builds on, of course, right? So because you need to have identities of users, employees, consumers, customers, partners, and so forth, suppliers and so forth, stored in somewhere, or even in modern terms, even agent identities. Those details will usually be stored in an identity store, and that identity store can typically be a LDAP, lightweight directory access protocol. We call LDAP directories, and Microsoft has Microsoft Active Directory, those are LDAPs, or it can even be a simple database. So it will enable provisioning and deprovisioning of accounts, user accounts and agent accounts. It creates, updates, onboards it, offboard it when it's not needed, or the person leaves the organization, or agent is deprovisioned and so forth. So it does those kind of things. And lifecycle synchronization, now that will be the single source of truth when it comes to who is there in your system, right? And it has to be consistent across every connected system and application in your network. So that's identity management. If you look at identity access management, it basically asks the question, who are you and what are you allowed to access? So that's the question it asks, and it's a layer built on top of identity management systems, of course, because you need to have identity stored somewhere, and it has to access those data to act upon it for authentication, authorization, single sign-on, and federation. Now, authentication is the process of verifying identities, typically via passwords and other mechanisms like biometrics, like fingerprint, face recognition, and so forth. If you look at authorization, it's about deciding what a verified identity user or an agent can do. And usually you would have heard of these terminologies called RBAC and ABAC. RBAC is role based access control. Users and human users and agents can be part of a certain role, and you can assign permissions to those roles as well. And this ABAC means attribute based access control. Based on certain attributes of the users and agents, you allow or deny certain permissions for that particular entity. So that's authorization. And then on top of all of these, you hear things like SSO and federation. SSO stands for single sign-on, especially when multiple applications are there in your organization, web applications particularly, and when a user or an agent has already logged in to one application, how do you seamlessly provide that user a login experience when it comes to another application? Especially when it comes to access using the same environment, such as the same browser or same device or something like that, right? So that's single sign-on, and it would not be a good experience to prompt the user every time the user has to access a new application in the same environment. So that's what the single sign-on addresses. And federation is basically how a particular user is granted access, especially when that user comes from a different domain. But you still have to provide access to the user. Think about a scenario where your organization has acquired or merged with another organization, and all the employees that in that other organization now needs to access your systems, your company applications, and so forth. How do you provide that authentication, authorization? That can be done through federation, and there are various protocols to do that thing, and we'll look at those things in a future video, but I just want to set the stage for that. That's basically what identity access management does. And typically identity access management is a separate product, and that will either have its own identity management system or rely on another identity management system such as an LDAP user store. Identity access management has two phases mainly, right? And we can split that into what we normally call as IAM, or custom identity access management, and workforce identity access management. Basically, IAM's audience is external customers and consumers. It could potentially be millions of users, such as the citizen of a country, right? And the priority in this case is to provide frictionless user experience, self-registration, social login, and consent management for these users. Core capabilities again, social and federated login, and progressive profiling as well. So progressive profiling is like you build the profile of the user progressively, not all at once, right? And consent and privacy controls, and also various integrations with different systems for allowing your customers to have the seamless experience. So the key question SIAM systems need to answer is how can they make login effortless for millions of customers while protecting their data. Workforce is rather internal, and especially when it comes to employees, contractors, partners, and it would not be in millions but typically in thousands, and also in tightly controlled. So here in this case, there needs to be uh, security and compliance be adhered to, especially when it comes to least privilege access. You don't provide access to your employees more than what they should have, and also enterprise wide single sign on as well, and various other capabilities. Now, if you look at the SIAM and workforce IAM, there are similarities, of course, when it comes to the core concepts that that don't change between SIAM and workforce IAM, right? It just remains the same. Only those details on what needs to be addressed to the workforce versus what needs to be addressed to a customer or consumer are different. Those are the aspects where things differ between customer identity and workforce identity access management. Identity governance, it mainly poses the question of should this person have this access and can we prove it, sort of a question. So you do access certification, basically periodic review and attestation of who has access to what, especially in an internal workforce environment, and segregation of duties, and especially conflicting access combinations and detecting and preventing toxic conflicting access combinations are all what you do with segregation of duties. And audit and reporting, and you do compliance for various specifications and regulations like GDPR and HIPAA, and you look into those things very seriously and do timely audits, and you use these systems to do that. And that's where identity governance systems are some systems or vendor products out there that does not mainly address mainly address the IGA or IAM fact or IDM fact, but it's built on top of it. So it will typically have identity access management capabilities to a certain extent, but not to the level of a full broad IAM solution or a workforce IAM solution. Privileged access management is orthogonal to all of those three. Basically, it asks the question of how do we control the accounts that could do the most damage, especially admin accounts, root accounts, or service accounts. And for that, these systems possibly support credential vaulting, securely storing and rotating privileged credentials and secrets, especially when it comes to admins. Their credentials are stored in a stored much more securely than other accounts, because those accounts can do a lot of damage, and there'll be much more monitoring and recording and auditing done in all of these privilege sessions, and you don't allow privilege sessions every time. Only at a certain time you elevate that uh, you know privileges, just in time evaluation. Only when needed you elevate it, and then monitor closely to see what happens. And you also make sure the user or the AI agent or whatnot gets off from that elevated status, and if not, you do alerting and things like that. So privilege access management systems address that space. So side by side, if you look at all of this, primary focus of IDM is identity data and lifecycle. IAM is authentication and authorization and access management. IGA does oversight and compliance, and PAM does high risk accounts, and you vet those accounts. And key questions those ask, to summarize, of course, in IDM, it asks the question of who exists. IAM asks the question of who can access what. IG asks the question of should they have it, should they have those privileges, and so forth. And PAM asks the question, how do we contain the risk? How do we minimize the privilege access, and so forth. Capabilities of IDM includes provisioning, deprovisioning, directories, storage, and things like that. IAM capabilities include single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, role-based access control. IGA capabilities include segregation of duty, certification, auditing, privilege access management, secure vaulting, just-in-time elevation, and session recording. And the risk IDM addresses is the fact that whether the accounts are stale or orphaned, and how do we clean it up. IAM address the unauthorized access, authorized or unauthorized access. It address the risk of unauthorized access. IGA address the risk of unchecked or unproven access. PAM address the compromised and admin accounts. And it attempts to avoid someone else getting elevated privileges and so forth. So how do they work together? So think about of an HR event, someone new gets hired, or one of the consumers in a SIAM case, gets onboarded, right? So in such a case, the role changes or some sort of a new event happened, right? And or the user got off from your system, right? So that is, you can call it a HR event. So this particular example thinks of a workforce scenario, but you can think it in the SIAM scenario as well. And then IDM provisioning happens. Identity management provisioning happens. The accounts get created in directories and systems and whatnot. And then comes the problem of IAM, whether that user can do certain operations, authentication and authorization, and then IGA verifies that, and access is always reviewed. So those are the steps. But when it comes to PAM, it just sits in IDM and think whether that particular user is a privileged user or not. And if that user is a privileged user, all the other steps that I mentioned when it comes to vaulting the credentials, elevating the credentials on just in time only, and recording the sessions and things like that will take place in a privileged access management solution. And let's think about a scenario like a person called Alex joining. That's the HR event. Alex logs into a system. That's when the IAM comes in or kicks in. And end of the quarter or end of the year or end of the half a year, you review the permissions of Alex, right? Alex's manager certifies that Alex still matches Alex's job and so forth. Maybe he has moved from different departments or different teams, and therefore access should be revoked in certain systems and new access should be granted. So that's what IGA does. And then maybe Alex becomes an admin or like a leadership person, where that person needs to have access to some privileged level systems and access, and admin credentials are vaulted, every privilege session is recorded. So those are the things that it answers. So where people get confused is mostly between IGA and IAM. So if you see identity governance and identity access management, think about it. The difference is IAM grants and enforces access. IGA reviews and audits whether that access should still exist. And sometimes people also get confused on PAM versus IAM, because IAM covers again authentication. PAM only adds control to privileged accounts, right? So that's the difference. And again, remember, PAM is not a replacement for IAM, right? And IAM systems are a must. It's the core of everything. IGA, identity management systems, are the foundation. And sometimes, depending on your industry, you might not necessarily need an IGA, or you might not necessarily need a PAM, but it's always the case, normally you need an IAM system, right? So think in that aspect. So foundation is the identity access management. Access management is the focus of identity access management, IAM, with both customers and employees. Governance is basically proving that access is still appropriate, and protection comes into play with PAM, locking down the accounts that matter the most. Basically, that's what it is, and I want to cover, and I believe this video has taught you something on what are the differences between IDM, IAM, IGA, and PAM. I'll see you next time in another video.